for more on the political impact of the numbers and what the road ahead looks like or doesn't, let's bring in At Issue for a special Wednesday edition of the panel. I made them all come back. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj all here tonight. Chantal, let's start with you. So some big numbers that might be surprising to some Canadians. Is this something, do you think, that I don't know, that a government has to better explain to Canadians, that it all makes sense because it's one-time spending because of the pandemic?
I think most Canadians who have been keeping up with the news expected those numbers to be really big, and they certainly lived up to that advanced billing. They may be higher than some expected, but we're talking about bigger and bigger than bigger. Nothing in the normal realm. And I don't think I've ever expected to be talking about anything related to a federal budget in any way, shape, or form that had numbers like that in it. The real unknown, and I think that's where the government cannot just let this slip, is that these numbers are almost a best case scenario. They do not take into account what happens if we're hit hard, as the US currently is, and how you deal with a big second wave.
Well, and that may be, Andrew, why the finance minister said we'll have more to say in the fall about recovery, because they are so, what do you think, concerned about what recovery could look like, really don't have a sense of anything?
Or they're trying to condition expectations. I think this explains why they've been so reluctant to produce even this quote-unquote snapshot until now, because these are much worse than anybody had expected or predicted. And as Chantal says, this is the optimistic scenario. This is if we get a relatively orderly recovery from the pandemic and from the economy. If it's worse, it's going to be worse. Remember also, this is just for year one. They refuse to tell us the numbers for years 2, 3, and 4. Again, I grant there's some uncertainty about that. But I think what the public needs and wants at this point is some sense, first of all, that the government is itself aware of the dimensions of the problem. And secondly, is willing to level with the public about that, about the kinds of hardships and sacrifices that are ahead of us. And thirdly, that they're willing to spell out some kind of plan for how we start to bring this deficit down. Remember, it's 16% this year of GDP, but on any construction of the numbers, it's going to be at least 5 or 6% next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. Are we just going to live with permanent 5% of GDP deficits, or is there going to be some kind of longer-term plan to get us back into fiscal sanity?
Althea, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't think actually the public cares that much. I think the public is focused on how they're handling their own household budgets, and they are thankful, I think, like the government's line about we're all in this together, and the government has basically made fiscal sacrifices so Canadian households did not have to bear the brunt of the challenge, or had to dig into their savings less or go into debt less, because the federal government was willing to, ensure that they were safe and mostly kept at home instead of going into the workspace. And I think really the best thing that has happened for Justin Trudeau, and I'm not taking anything from what Chantal and Andrew have said, because I do agree that there's no recovery plan and there's no future look ahead. It is that there is Donald Trump and chaos south of the border, and there is an example over there about how things can happen when you have no plan and nothing seems to happen properly. And I think Canadians are looking at that and thinking, okay, well, these are big numbers that the government is saying at the moment, but at least things are not as bad as they are in the United States.
Chantal, yeah.
And while the numbers are certainly big, stunning, and they will have consequences for years to come, I'm not totally convinced that it is possible for a government to come up with a serious, solid recovery plan with all that is unknown ahead of it still. This isn't as if something big happened and now we're going to rebuild. We are still in this pandemic process. I think from those numbers, though, what you can see is that we can't, or the federal government cannot afford a second lockdown that would have it support Canadians in the way that it did over the first one.
I tried to ask the Prime Minister today, Andrew, like what would the economy look like, going forward, and that's not even something they wanted to talk about today, because they want people to still be talking about the urgency of the situation as opposed to the recovery.
And they want people to be looking at all the measures they put in place. I mean, most of this thing was a kind of a recitation of past policies that they put in place, which is fine. But I think what we need at this point is some sense of What's the urgency on the government side? For example, does it plan to roll back all of these short-term crisis things all at once in 1 year? Or is it going to listen to the council of people who say we need fiscal stimulus on top of this? We need to wind back really gradually. That will have huge implications for the kinds of deficit and debt numbers we're looking at going forward. You know, they say, and there's some truth to this, that we don't need to worry about this because interest rates are so low. But a lot of that is predicated on the idea that they're going to be able to borrow a lot of this long term. They announced that. But just simply announcing that's their intention and actually carrying it off with these kinds of numbers is two different things. And it's going to be really concerning to see, with every government in the world coming to the market at the same time with these enormous deficits, whether in fact they'll be able to load all this into the longer term debt markets.
Althea, you wanted in there, sorry.
Yeah, what we got today was basically a snapshot in time. And then the finance minister telling us that they're ready and willing and they want to spend a lot more money. They said taxes are not going to increase, that Minister Morneau's basically spelled out that he believes that what the economy needs is even more federal spending. He talked about sick leave, childcare, more help for the vulnerable, more help for people in nursing homes. He outlined areas in which the federal government is willing to spend more money, helping municipalities, for example. And that is all going, like today's snapshot is lovely, but it is not at all the end all and be all and what's going to happen, you know, when we have this discussion in December. They clearly have and are communicating that they expect to and plan to spend a hell of a lot more money.
Can they grow their way out of where they are now? Because that's the other thing that the finance minister suggested there, Chantal.
Well, they can grow their way out of a federal election with the way they are now. You know, if you call this a lovely snapshot, it's an interesting way to say it. I think most people would say, can we file this one away and not put it in the family album? But if they want to stay in government, it is a minority government. This talk about, you know, sick leave, etc., will keep them going. It is also going to get them reelected between now and 18 months, rather than the speech of we're going to come down on you with more taxes and cuts to programs to people who are already impoverished. So if we're talking about the politics of this, it is possibly, I don't know, bad policy, too early to tell, certainly good politics.
Okay, I got to leave it there. Thank you. I got to leave. I'm sorry. Thank you all for coming in. I appreciate it. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to our podcast. It's on any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/The National. I'll give Andrew more time next time. I'll be back. They'll all be back with the At Issue panel tomorrow. We're going to be taking some of your political questions. For now, though, back to Adrian in Toronto.